100% of the time.
Buried underneath this granite mountain, North America's early warning system, NORAD.
The family fallout shelter.
America needed a way to detect a Soviet nuclear attack and to defend itself if a strike took place. As a result, the Canadians and the Americans agreed to build a continent-wide early warning system. NORAD was born.
The earlier that you knew the attack was coming, the better your defenses would be, and the more likely it would be that you would be successful in defending the United States and Canada against an air attack.
First, the two nations had to build a nuclear attack detection network. For this, they used the most sophisticated radar technology.
Given the fact that bombers would have to fly in a northerly direction to attack the United States or Canada, it was established that an early warning system of radars throughout the northern parts of Canada and Alaska would be the most appropriate way to provide this early warning.
In June 1955, construction began on a string of remote radar sites north of the Arctic Circle. This ice-bound early warning system was known as the Distant Early Warning, or DEW line.
They blasted holes for the foundations out of the frozen earth. They mixed concrete and heated tents. As they poured the concrete in the bitter cold, they kept it from freezing by pumping in heat under tarpaulins.
These radar outposts were expected to give defense forces at least a 2-hour warning of a Soviet bomber attack. But the early warning network had even more eyes trained on the skies. Off the coast of New York and Boston, so-called Texas towers built on oil drilling platforms provided additional radar coverage. Squadrons of EC-121 radar aircraft scanned the skies, and Navy ocean picket warning ships kept watch at sea. And if radar wasn't enough, thousands of civilians helped out too in the Civilian Ground Observer Corps.
You had the Civilian Ground Observer Corps, which was composed of, I think, several tens of thousands, maybe even more than 100,000 volunteer observers in the United States and Canada who would man these outposts. Some of them try to man some of them around the clock.
In the days of the Soviet bomber threat, this early warning network was intended to give NORAD time to scramble its massive defense forces to fight the intruder.
In the early days of NORAD, there were significant numbers of fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missiles that were available to conduct an intercept on what was perceived to be the threat of the day, which was the Soviet bomber with a free-fall weapon.
NORAD had at its disposal an impressive assortment of ground-to-air missiles, including some armed with nuclear-tipped weapons.
We had the Nike Ajax system, which was a ground-based weapon that was manned by the Army to go after Soviet bombers, and then we supplemented and then replaced that with Nike Hercules, which was a nuclear-armed system.
These are most appropriate for what we would call point defense. If you have a particularly valuable target or a city, for example, you could range air defense artillery units around that to defend against an air threat.
NORAD also had hundreds of armed fighters at its beck and call, ready for air-to-air combat with Soviet forces.
One early concept called for actually dropping atomic bombs from U.S. aircraft on Soviet bomber formation, sort of air-to-air bombing, which presented enormous problems, and it didn't really get very far. But out of that developed the idea that you could have nuclear-armed interceptor missiles. And so we developed the Genie, for example, air-to-air missile, which was launched from U.S. fighter interceptors to go after Soviet bomber formations.
Despite these defense forces, North America's entire early warning and air defense system was at risk because its command center at Ent Air Force Base in Colorado was a sitting duck.
It became very clear fairly soon that if the Soviets were able to take out our early warning nerve center, they could basically paralyze the entire American retaliatory capability.
General Earl Partridge, who was the head of the command at that time, said, "This is not a secure facility. Any fool with a bazooka could stand out on the highway out there and destroy this building. We need to have something that's more secure."
And so a decision was made in the late 1950s that we needed to dig a very deep bunker under Cheyenne Mountain to try to protect this vital nerve center of America's defenses.
NORAD was about to go underground, and not a moment too soon. the Soviets were about to introduce a nuclear device that would render the existing NORAD obsolete. In 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik and ushered in the age of the intercontinental ballistic missile.
Спутник еще раз открыл глаза миру на нашу Родину и нашу революцию. Он вызвал невиданное смятение умов в лагере врагов социализма и коммунизма.
Here we were preparing for a massive Soviet bomber attack, which of course never materialized, and suddenly they've created the ability to launch a nuclear warhead on a missile.
This was a big problem for NORAD. North America's existing early warning and air defense system was powerless against the missile threat.
With a flight time of only half an hour, there really wasn't very much time to do anything about it, and it was basically flying over the entire network of radars and interceptors that we had erected to deal with the bomber threat.
So suddenly, our entire multi-billion-dollar air defense network, and we did spend hundreds of billions of dollars on it, is essentially junk.
The Soviet nuclear missile threat required an invulnerable and indestructible early warning system, and at the moment, NORAD was neither. It was time to put NORAD's command center underground, where it could survive a nuclear attack. Cheyenne Mountain, a granite mound near NORAD's headquarters at Ent Air Force Base, seemed the perfect safe haven. Excavation of the mountain began in June of 1961 and took 12 months.
They used conventional mining techniques, using 1.5 million pounds of TNT to excavate about 700,000 tons of granite.
You drill and you muck out, you drill and you muck out, and then the third shift you usually do some maintenance on equipment. You're going 6 days a week with your activities, and that's the way that goes.
But this was no simple tunnel the miners were drilling. This excavation job was more complicated.
It wasn't a cylinder, it was a horseshoe-shaped gallery intersected by narrower galleries, and in that configuration you place buildings.
More than 1,000 feet of granite overhead would protect NORAD from attack. But that was just one element of the facility's nuclear defenses. Rock bolts reinforced the granite walls, giving the mountain added strength to absorb shock waves. And NORAD's layout was designed to blunt the impact of a nuclear blast.
The entrance tunnel goes straight through the mountain and then ends in a sort of an escape hatch on the far side. Then the main facility is built in a cave that is carved off the side. The whole idea is if you put a nuclear weapon, say, at the entrance of the cave where you go in, the blast and force would go right on through the mountain and not go into where the people are working and living.
When much of the 4.5 acres was already excavated, construction came to a screeching halt. The entire project was in jeopardy because of problems with the rock above the B2 intersection.
The B2 intersection is the intersection of the B gallery with one of the cross chambers, and we found that the arch there was mushy. It was faulty, and it would not stay in place if this facility was attacked. It would all come down.
To make matters worse, the B2 junction was no ordinary intersection. The very heart of Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD's command center, was supposed to lie underneath. Engineers devised a two-step solution. As a temporary measure, they built a giant steel column to hold up the faulty rock. Then they built this concrete dome and moved it into place above the intersection. 30-foot-high supports were added to hold up the dome and to displace any shock waves in the event of an attack.
We had to reinforce that whole thing, and that was done with a massive concrete dome right up against the rock. And if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have a NORAD in that location today.
In case 1,000 feet of steel-hard granite didn't provide enough protection, the buildings inside Cheyenne Mountain were built to withstand the potential effects of a nuclear blast: electromagnetic pulse, ground shock, and radiation.
The real challenge was how do you take this facility you're putting inside the hole and make it resistant to the effects of weapons. That was where the difficulty came.
One potential problem A nuclear blast would generate electromagnetic pulses that would destroy the mountain's sensitive electronic equipment. So, the buildings inside Cheyenne Mountain were encased in a sheath of welded steel. A second concern, the effect of nuclear blast aftershocks on the complex. The engineers decided to rest all 15 underground buildings on 3-foot coils, 1,300 in all.
Every one of these buildings is set on giant springs, and that was so in the event of an earthquake, a huge earthquake, or a nuclear blast or something like that, the buildings would sway but would remain stable and all the equipment inside would remain functioning.
If there was a nuclear attack, Cheyenne Mountain would face a problem of air supply. So, engineers designed air intake valves that could shut automatically to protect the facility during a nuclear blast, but still survive a shock wave. After the attack, these same valves would bring in post-attack air, sending it through a series of screens to filter out radiation and biological and chemical contaminants. One last protective measure, 2 30-ton blast doors to seal off the buildings from the rest of the world in the event of a nuclear attack.
When you go inside Cheyenne Mountain, the first thing you come to are these huge, huge doors. These are the famous nuclear blast doors. During the Cold War, had there been a nuclear incident, these doors would slam shut and the 1,000 people inside Cheyenne Mountain would be able to continue to live during a nuclear blast.
If everything worked as planned and the underground complex withstood a nuclear blast, the men inside would need provisions.
Inside Cheyenne Mountain, there's enough water, power, food, and supplies to keep 800 people alive for 30 days.
We have kerosene, huge tanks of kerosene to run diesel generators to give us electricity. And then even in the halls, there are certain stations where food is stored, these MREs, these prepackaged meals.
Even an internal water supply was provided, thanks to reservoirs that had been dug inside the mountain.
There's a domestic water supply of some 1.5 million gallons. There's an industrial water supply of 4.5 million gallons.
This, then, is NORAD, our $150 million command post that lets us breathe more freely, sleep a little more soundly. The ultimate answer to any enemy, any aggressor.
Cheyenne Mountain was too big to be kept secret, which suited the United States military just fine. They wanted the world to know about this underground complex.
One of the points of Cheyenne Mountain was to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that regardless of what happened, the United States would still have this vital nerve center that would enable us to detect an attack and make necessary preparations for ordering a retaliation.
Well, the primary function from the military viewpoint of Cheyenne Mountain is to provide the warning needed to launch a retaliatory attack. It also would provide the civil defense elements the warning they need in order to institute response to nuclear attack.
If there is a warning, you will hear it before the bomb explodes.
With that alarm, citizens might have time to duck and cover. But Cheyenne Mountain was only as good as its surveillance network, and that system needed serious improvement in the face of advances in the strength, speed, and accuracy of Soviet nuclear weapons.
Once the Soviets developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, the whole structure of the U.S. early warning system had to rapidly change. Of course, we developed our own intercontinental ballistic missiles to have the capability to launch a retaliatory strike. But the U.S. had to then go ahead and develop a much more capable set of radars that could warn of an ICBM launch.
They were called BMUs, Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. They were located in Greenland, in England, and also in Alaska.
Other radars were designed to detect nuclear missiles launched from submarines. But all these powerful new radars still didn't give NORAD as much time as it needed to warn of a missile attack and to give the president time to respond.
In the Cold War, the trick is knowing when you're under attack and then making the proper decisions to respond to that attack. So time is critical. You have about 30 minutes from the launch of a ballistic missile until it impacts on the United States.
All of our big warning radars would only see it about halfway through its flight, 15 minutes, very little time to respond. When minutes are critical, we needed everything that we could to detect the launch of Soviet missiles as soon as possible.
So we developed infrared sensing satellites, and what they do is they stare down on the entire Earth, and when they see a hot streak of infrared coming off and it's moving, then that is reported back as a missile warning.
The satellites gave NORAD the time it needed to warn the president and his advisors of incoming missiles. Enough time for the nation's leadership to launch the only known defense against a Soviet nuclear missile attack, a retaliatory strike.
And the goal, in reality, would be to try and shoot the Archer, as opposed to trying to conduct a defense within North America.
For more than 30 years, NORAD crews deep inside Cheyenne Mountain scanned the skies, waiting for World War III to begin. But then the world changed. NORAD would have to change too. For more than 30 years, Cheyenne Mountain crews kept their eyes fixed on the sky, ready for action at the first alert of attack. But in the 1980s, America's mortal enemy disintegrated, and so it seemed had NORAD's mission.
President Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party, allowed political reform and economic reform to move faster than he was able to control in Eastern Europe.
Gorbachev's reforms quickly led to rebellion against Soviet control. On November 9, 1989, the greatest symbol of Soviet domination crumbled. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was only a matter of time before other countries shook off communist rule.
The Soviet Union is offering to negotiate the withdrawal of its troops from Poland and says it's ready to reduce Soviet troop strength in the East Bloc without waiting for a treaty to be signed.
Pro-democracy demonstrators in Romania called for independence. The Russian army withdrew from Czechoslovakia, only to take up positions in Moscow.
Columns of tanks and armored troop carriers rumbled into the center of Moscow. They assumed positions outside the Kremlin and in other strategic locations.
Finally, Russia itself defied the Communist Party. Soviet communism was history, and the threat of nuclear Armageddon receded.
We now have an unparalleled opportunity to change the nuclear posture of both the United States and the Soviet Union.
The United States and Russia buried the hatchet, agreeing to dismantle portions of their vast nuclear arsenals. The Cold War was over. Perhaps it was time to mothball Cheyenne Mountain.
In the aftermath of the Cold War, the threat scenario changed. The geopolitical situation had changed. The relevance of Cheyenne Mountain, in some circles, came into question.
The end of the Cold War, I think, got people to thinking that maybe in a decade or so, Cheyenne Mountain would be out of business, but certainly not overnight. This was a kind of a moment in time, and it would soon pass.
And the reason that moment passed was because a new enemy appeared, Saddam Hussein. The Gulf War revealed that NORAD's Cold War habits had real value in the post-Cold War world.
During the Gulf War, Cheyenne Mountain sort of performed in miniature without nuclear weapons, a lot of what it was planning to do in World War III during the Cold War.
When Saddam Hussein's Scud missiles were launched, the crews at Cheyenne Mountain would immediately detect them on their satellites.
They would provide voice warning to us in theater via an open telephone line. And it would be nothing more than Scud alert, Scud alert.
But Cheyenne Mountain's task didn't end with that first phone call to the Middle East. The crews used their expertise to identify the Scud's likely target. When NORAD determined the Scud's destination, it passed the warning along to Gulf forces, and the alert would go out. Civilians had time to take cover, and Patriot missile crews had time to aim and fire at the incoming Scud. While the Patriot didn't always find its target, NORAD's Gulf War record was flawless. Cheyenne Mountain found itself with a new mission and a new lease on life.
What happened to us in the Gulf War with using Cheyenne Mountain to provide ballistic missile response warning has now been translated to all the unified commands around the world.
NORAD has survived in the post-Cold War era, in part because of its ability to adapt to changing threats.
One of the things that has been important for NORAD is that since the Cold War, we have always attempted to evolve our mission to be relevant to what's happening today.
It might surprise you to learn that one of NORAD's new missions relates to an old problem: the threat of nuclear war between Russia and the United States. Despite cutbacks in nuclear arsenals, both the U.S. and Russia still have thousands of nuclear warheads ready to launch in just minutes. But Russia's control over its nuclear weapons is weak, and its early warning system suffers from acute decay, raising serious concerns.
The Russians have their own version of Cheyenne Mountain and their own version of the satellites and the radars that feed data into Cheyenne Mountain.
Like a number of other military capabilities in Russia, though, they have atrophied over time due to lack of resources or or other priorities that they've had to assign their military budget to.
There was this event in 1995 which did indicate how far the Soviet Union, how far Russia had fallen from its Cold War heights.
One, fire. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
There was a false alarm from a Norwegian testing rocket that was launched in 1995 and detected by the Russian ballistic missile defense early warning system.
The Russians, through their command and control and early warning system, saw that Norwegian rocket launch, but they misinterpreted the whole event, and they thought that there was a potential of a nuclear missile being launched against them.
For a few agonizing minutes, the Russian technicians watching their radar screens thought that this might be the beginning of a launch from U.S. Trident submarine.
Ultimately, the situation was diffused, but the event raised the specter of accidental nuclear war and resulted in a new and ironic mission for post-Cold War NORAD, helping prevent nuclear war by helping the Russians.
Cheyenne Mountain now has a growing mission to be on the lookout for a small-scale Russian nuclear attack, and not only to warn of that attack, but also to prevent it by working with the Russians to shore up their own system of warning.
One of the first tests of the mountain's newest nuclear mission took place on New Year's Eve 2000. That's when everyone feared that a Y2K computer glitch might cause Russians to misinterpret satellite data and start World War III by accident. The solution: Russian and U.S. military officers sitting side by side to watch the world missile launch situation using Cheyenne Mountain data.
So once again, Cheyenne Mountain's mission has evolved. Yes, it keeps watch on Russia, but now it keeps very close watch on just about everybody else. It watches China, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Libya, all the countries that we are very concerned about, and we're concerned that they could launch a conventional ballistic missile against the U.S.
No matter who the enemy is, the U.S. military still has no defense against a missile attack. A problem everyone wants to solve. A solution NORAD may command. Nuclear missile launches aren't the only events that trigger NORAD's early warning system. If a plane enters U.S. airspace without properly identifying itself, the pilot might find himself with NORAD escorts.
On a day-to-day basis, there are 20 fighters on alert around the periphery of North America to conduct an intercept on an unknown or a threatening aircraft.
These fighters are really all that remain of NORAD's air defense forces. The vast winged arsenal of the 1950s and 60s was eventually mothballed when the bomber threat was overshadowed by the missile threat, a threat the United States could not and still cannot defend against.
It's a very critical military problem. If you do not have a defensive system that can launch a U.S. missile to hit and destroy an incoming enemy ballistic missile before it reaches the U.S., the only option you're left with is an offensive retaliation, launching a U.S. missile against a target in Russia or China or Iran or Iraq. And today, That's the only option we have.
But the United States has tried to develop other options. For almost 50 years, the military has struggled to deploy a weapon that could destroy incoming missiles.
When the Soviet missile threat emerged, the initial thought was to do to Soviet missiles what we planned to do to Soviet bombers, shoot them down.
So we started scaling up some of our air defense systems to see if we could deal with them in that way.
One early anti-missile weapon deployed by the United States was the Nike Zeus, a single missile designed to intercept incoming Soviet missiles. Once the Soviets were able to threaten the United States with a massive missile attack, an effort was made to develop an anti-missile network.
In the 1960s, we came up with something called the Sentinel system, which would have been a nationwide system of multiple sites defending U.S. military installations as well as U.S. cities, population centers.
In 1969, Sentinel was scaled down and renamed Safeguard, one single radar designed to defend a field of Minuteman missile silos from nuclear attack. Safeguard was shut down after just 133 days of operations. Without a missile defense, the United States was left with just one option: mutual assured destruction.
And by the mid-1970s, we'd pretty much given up on the idea of trying to shoot down Soviet missiles after they had been launched.
Yeah, I've got a good enable message command transmitted. Ready for key turn?
And we're relying on Cheyenne Mountain to give us warning of the launch so that we could launch in response so that the Soviets wouldn't launch to begin with.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, key turn.
Ronald Reagan, among others, was never happy with this condition of mutual assured destruction, and so in 1983 he announced his Strategic Defense Initiative.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
President Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, and during his presidency, the military spent billions trying, unsuccessfully, to develop a missile defense system. Then, the effort to build SDI lost momentum when the Soviet Union disintegrated. But even as one enemy faded from the scene, other enemies took its place.
President Clinton has another major foreign policy challenge on his hands: what to do about North Korea's refusal to come clean on its nuclear weapons program.
Because of concerns about a potential missile threat from nations like North Korea and Iraq, research and testing continue on a more limited missile defense program.
What it will do, it will be a deterrent, hopefully, against the North Koreas of the world, who seem bent on preparing or to develop ballistic missiles on a very limited basis.
The missile defense idea. The United States will launch an interceptor weapon at the first warning of an attack. And once in space, the kill vehicle will maneuver itself to intercept and destroy the incoming missile. An innovative idea, but one that's proved hard to turn into reality.
Early this morning over the Pacific Ocean, the military's attempt to shoot down a dummy missile failed, the second failure in 3 tries.
But if the technical problems can be resolved, NORAD's mission may once again change, this time to include command and control of a national missile defense system. And, as it has for nearly half a century, Cheyenne Mountain's mission will continue to evolve to meet new threats.
The relevance of Cheyenne Mountain has continued over time by changing missions. It's probably safe to say that if we were still worried about only the manned bomber dropping a free-fall weapon, Cheyenne Mountain's relevance today would not be there. You might be visiting the museum as opposed to a relevant operational organization.